of the Architecture, Heritage and Urbanisms of West Africa Research Center. And we're delighted that you are able to join us for this important talk by Professor Tom Goodfellow. When we invited Tom to speak, he said, I don't know anything about urban heritage, but we said, well, just come and share, what you're working on at the moment, and I'm sure there will be a lot to learn. So I'll just go right on and introduce our guest speaker for today. Our guest speaker is a leading scholar in the political economy of urban development. His work spans the politics of urban land and transportation, infrastructure, housing, and institutional change in cities. He joined the University of Manchester in January 2026 as Professor of Urban Development at the Global Development Institute. Prior to that, he was Professor of Urban Development?
Something like that. Urban Studies and Development.
Urban Studies and Development at the University of Sheffield. And he will shortly be assuming the role of the CEO of the African Cities Research Consortium. We're privileged to have Tom speak to us because he's one of the most distinctive voices in urban development research today, with his work cutting across various contexts of power and cities, and with field experience across Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, and other cities in Africa. His scholarship is grounded and is theoretically sharp. Tom also advises leading international development organizations, from the FCDO to UN Habitat and NECA. And we are very interested in the work he's doing at the intersection of urbanism and politics. So today he'll be talking to us on popular infrastructures of transcontinental urbanism, tactics of urban living between the UK and Somali peninsula. A bit of a caveat before we hand over the mic to Tom. Please, you can put in your comments and questions as the lecture is going on, and then we will then engage with the issues right after. So over to you, Tom. Thanks very much for coming and welcome to Liverpool.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's really good to be here and to see some familiar faces and a lot of new ones. I'm sitting here looking at the screen where I can't see many faces, but I know there's some people there. And of course, I'm in the room here with colleagues from Liverpool. And it's really nice to be engaging with this research centre, which I've heard a lot about since before it even began, I think. And it's really wonderful to come here. As Taibat said, I don't generally see myself as somebody who works on heritage or have a lot of knowledge of heritage and academic debates on heritage. But I know that heritage is also a broad concept. And actually, the project I'll be talking about, it does engage, I think, with ideas of heritage in some ways. So yeah, it's really good to be here. I'm talking about work that's also quite unusual for me. So as Taibat explained, I've done quite a lot of comparative work, and in this case, I'm actually doing work in the UK. Most of this project has been in the UK. And so when Taibat sort of invited me to do this lecture, along with Ola, I made a few suggestions about things I could present. And one of them was to present from this project, which is a project currently in its final year, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And this project is different from my usual work. As I say, it's primarily based in the UK, and it's around issues of diaspora, questions of urban citizenship and integration, specifically with Somali community groups in the UK and Somali diaspora communities who move between the UK and Somalia. So I wanted to do something that was about the UK, about our current sort of state of debate on issues around migration in some ways, but really also to work with communities in the cities where I live and other cities in the UK to understand better some of those experiences of urban life for Somali diaspora, which are a particularly large group in many UK cities, including, I think, in Liverpool, but also in Sheffield, where I live, in the part of London where I'm from. And so this project is much more UK focused, and it's focused in a kind of the whole area of diaspora and migration studies, which is not something I've worked in previously. But when I suggested to Taibat that this might be something I could present on, among other things, she said, oh, that would be great, because I understand there is a theme, a stream of work that might be developed here, focusing on migrants in the UK, West African migrants perhaps. So this experience of Somali migrants and Somali diaspora and British Somalis in UK cities is, I guess, will have a number of similarities, but also many differences, the experiences of West African communities. And I'm sure there are also many people in the audience who've come to the UK as migrants, or maybe their families have, and they have that kind of experience of dual identity, of dual citizenship, of living between two continents, much more than I do. So this is something I became interested in talking to Somali colleagues and friends in Sheffield initially. But it's not something I have a lived experience of. But of course, a lot of it is just about the cities and the urban experience. And we really wanted to do something that would be about the UK and Africa, and exploring those connections between cities, between urban experiences, and how they play out for people. And I must emphasize this is very collaborative work. I'll talk about the whole project team in a moment, but for this presentation, I'm crediting my two of the colleagues I'm working with most closely on the project, Abdi Fattah Tahir, who's a researcher formerly at Manchester and Sheffield for a while, based in Mogadishu, and Kathy Wilcock, who's based in the University of Manchester with me. And there's a much wider team that's fed into this, as I'll explain. So I want to say a little bit more about what I'm going to say, but I also want to be clear that this is very much a work in progress. So it's not, I haven't got a fully developed argument. It's not a lecture in that sense. I kind of want to test out a few things and share some quite raw data, because we have a lot of data, qualitative data, and I'll talk about the methods. So we're kind of drowning in that data right now and thinking about the various things we could do with it, including with the community groups we're working with. So the project, we use the acronym TRUCIT, which stands for Transcontinental Urban Citizenship. I'll say a bit more about that term and why we've used it in a moment. So I'll give an overview of the project before saying a little bit about Somali diaspora and the nature of Somali transnationalism, which has some quite specific characteristics linked to Somalia's experience and the size of the diaspora around the world. And then I want to kind of go a bit into the qualitative data, including data from focus group discussions we had quite recently, as well as some interview data about how people make their homes in cities in the UK, but also how that's connected to these different ideas of home, both here and in cities within the Somali Peninsula. So I'll draw on some of the data we have with people who've returned, because we have interviews we've been doing with British Somalis who've gone back to Mogadishu, to Hargeisa, places in Somalia and Somaliland. And I'll draw on different kinds of qualitative data, including summaries of some of the life history stories, as well as focus group material and interviews. And it's really very raw at this point. There's a lot more I wanted to do in this talk if I'd had more time, but I haven't really been able to kind of do that level of analysis yet. But hopefully by sharing some of these things, they can provoke some discussion. And then I'll come back to this idea of what we might call infrastructures of transcontinental urbanism at the end. So apologies for the kind of rawness and work in progress that I'm showing. But I want to give a picture of the full project and then some of the data. So I started this project because I developed a research proposal for this after talking to various colleagues, and a long time ago. It was really like before COVID when I first was developing this idea. And of course, we'd had Brexit, we'd had financial crisis, and then we had COVID. And one of the things that was very apparent was this unequal sense of citizenship among different groups within the UK, including issues of racism, discrimination, marginalisation, feeling like particular groups were evidently more affected by the various crises hitting the UK than others. But this was also combined with people's, often many people's dual citizenship and their kind of belonging in other places, where they sometimes also felt like they weren't full members of the society here or there. Right, so this sense of unequal citizenship in two places, which came through very strongly from discussions with the Somali community, was a motivating factor. And then we wanted to explore this at the level of the city. So I will try and draw out the urban dimensions of the project as much as possible, obviously being an urban heritage seminar series. The Somali community, I think, offers a particular lens on this experience of unequal citizenship. Due to the long history, so Somalis have been here for a long time in the UK, often over 100 years, having come during colonialism for various reasons as sailors, as workers in the steel industry in places like Sheffield, but then of course as refugees in large numbers from the 1990s onwards. And there's been a lot of success about their experience, but there's also been a long history of marginalisation. And you now have recurrent crises as well in Somalia, in the wider Horn of Africa, that have also led to new waves of people coming and new demands and challenges on the communities that are here. So it's an interesting way to really look at how people have managed crisis in their home region, at the same time as recurrent crises in the UK that have hit particular groups hard in our cities here. So these are some of the literatures we are engaging with. And the idea was to bridge this literature on urban citizenship that's very much about rights to the city, what it means to be a citizen in the city, what rights and responsibilities you have, what kinds of participation make you feel like a citizen, your relationship with the state. That's one literature. Then we wanted to bring in literature on diaspora and transnationalism and kind of the whole idea of transnational belonging. And then, of course, there's the literature on this particular part of the world. And really, mostly those are separate areas of research. And so the idea of this project is really to bring them together. There has been a lot of a lot of research specifically on the Somali refugee community in the UK. But that's very focused in the space of refugees. And, most of the Somalis now in the UK probably do not consider themselves refugees, even if that's their family experience. And it's quite outdated as well in terms of the particular dynamics around housing and urban challenges, because there was a lot of literature from the 90s and 2000s and less since, even though we had all these changes in the UK. And so we're particularly interested in how the different generations of first, second, third generations of Somali migrants in the UK experience urban life differently, have different kinds of connections to the UK relative to Somali and Somalia, and also how that's very, very affected by gender as well. So different gender dynamics within different generations that we're trying to explore in different cities. So there's a lot going on, but we really want to not flatten the experience that's actually very diverse. As part of that, I should also mention the reason I keep saying Somali Peninsula and Somalia and Somaliland is, of course, because Somalia has the kind of semi-autonomous region within it of Somaliland that claims independence and is seeking recognition. So we have to use these categories carefully because there are different forms of identification within the Somali Peninsula. So again, just on the kind of wider aims of the project, we're looking at how the connection between the experience of life in UK cities and what's happening within Somalia and how those things are connected, how they intersect. I've sort of made this point, but also where the British state comes in, both in terms of what the local government service provision in cities, the local face of the state, and then what the UK government is doing in its foreign policy, its development policy, its humanitarian programs, because these things actually connect in the experiences of lots of Somalis, and those connections are not always explored. And then finally, one thing we hope to do, and maybe part of this discussion can also take that in, is how the experience of Somalis, particularly in UK cities, might be useful for other groups that have come more recently as refugees and maybe a first generation or going into a second, but haven't been here for such a long period of time. And we have a PhD student who's working on these issues around comparing Somali refugee community organisation in cities with, for example, Sudanese or Eritrean groups, who's taking forward some of that work. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this other background stuff due in the interest of time. Again, it's some of the other themes we're looking at, which I've already mentioned. But I mean, just this quote, which was prior to our research, this came from some reporting where some Somali people were interviewed in the context of around COVID times, where this sense of not belonging here and not belonging there really came through, which is something we wanted to kind of explore more in the project and understand why. So this was a kind of diagram that I used again back at proposal stage to try and set out the different connections we're trying to explore in the project. So as I mentioned, on the one hand, it's about urban citizenship, it's about cities in England, really. I've said the UK, but I'm increasingly thinking, well, actually, the three cities we're looking at are in England. England has its own identity issues and its own, obviously, policy frameworks for some things. So to be clear, we're mainly focusing on English cities. But then we're also looking at what government policy does and what's happening in Somalia and Somaliland. And these things are connected in all kinds of ways that come through the lived experience of people we're speaking to. So those are kind of intersecting. They all have an effect on people's urban citizenship and belonging. And they are connected through these actual infrastructures, digital, financial, social, physical in some ways, that I'll try and tease out a little bit in this talk, and which would have been a more central focus if I'd been able to get further into the analysis. So just to say where we're doing the research, we're looking at three cities, and the idea was to work in places that have a very different history of Somali settlement in the UK, that have a very different heritage, that have a very different geography in terms of where Somali communities have settled, sometimes more or less concentrated. Bristol is interesting. It has probably the closest parallels to Liverpool of the cities we're working in, or Cardiff, for example, in Wales, being a port city and having that history of Somali sailors. Somalis were brought in during the British Empire. Somalis from northern Somalia, Somaliland, as it's now known, which was a British colony. And so in Bristol, there are very large numbers of Somalis. They're the largest ethnic minority. They've overtaken West Indian or West African communities that are also there. And they're very concentrated in certain areas. I'll show a map in a moment. But we also see we see people who've come from both North and South Somalia. And we see people who come through Europe. So a lot of EU secondary settlement from Somalis who went to the Netherlands or to Norway or Denmark or elsewhere, and then came to the UK for particular reasons. So that gives quite an interesting lens that we don't get so much in a city like Sheffield. Sheffield is interesting because it had this older community that were there working in the steel industry, and then it had very large numbers of refugees, but almost all of them were coming from northern Somalia. So it's a strongly Somaliland community, the majority anyway, not exclusively, but the majority. It also has an interesting history as the UK's first city of sanctuary. So it was the first city in the UK to really mobilise around refugee rights and asylum seeker rights and the kind of culture of welcome. And it was the first city, and it was, I don't know if it's the only city that's kind of officially recognised Somaliland, which is quite interesting, particularly because there is obviously politics around that can be quite difficult, particularly at the present time, given what's going on geopolitically and how Somaliland fits into that picture. And then we looked at Camden, because London is just too big to take on as a whole. And it's also, I'm quite biased because it's where I'm from, but also it has a really interesting geography of inequality, and Somalis are concentrated in part of that. It has a good mix of north and south as well, and it gives us a sense of London and its connectivity. I'll say a bit more, but the proximity to King's Cross and all the redevelopment has been an interesting feature.
So what dates did the Camden compared to, you've got Bristol,
Yeah,
1940s, post-war?
Yeah, so I couldn't tell you off the top of my head when the Somalis first came out. I'm sure it would have been a long time ago, but it does have one of the oldest community groups we're working with. So a lot of the community organisations in London appeared before they did elsewhere in the country. And so there we've got a group that I think dates back to the 80s, if not 90s, which is a lot older. Yeah, but the longer history is probably more complex. Yeah, and then, as I said, we initially wanted to have three cities in Somalia and Somaliland that would mirror the three cities here, because there actually were three that came through. But in the end, just for practical reasons, and there's been much more activity in Hargeisa and Mogadishu. So we focused on those two cities to do some interviews with returnees who've been in those cities, trying to understand what does growing up in Bristol or Sheffield mean for what you do when you go back? How does your experience of integration or discrimination there affect your affiliation with Somaliland and your ability to integrate back there? These are some of the questions we've asked, while also taking a critical eye on the idea of integration, which I'm not going to talk about that much here, but that's very much part of the project as well, is to challenge some of the mainstream ideas of integration. So this is the team we're working with. We've got Kathy and Abdi, as I mentioned, are kind of research fellows on the project. And then we've got Muna, who's a co-investigator based in Sheffield, an academic who is an independent consultant. Paula Meth, who may be known to some of you, now at the University of Glasgow. And then we've had Uba and Jamali, who've helped with data collection. Jamali's also working on a PhD, as well as various people who are in kind of consultancy roles on the project, advising on specific issues. And then what's been really interesting recently is we've had Somali Public Agenda, which is a kind of think tank based in Mogadishu. We've done a lot of research for us there. Very hard for researchers employed in the UK to go there because of the risk assessment issues. But this is an established organisation who we've then met and had a workshop with around the data they collected in Mogadishu. And these are the community groups. So we've got, the idea was to have 2 community groups in each city. And this, I think, gets maybe into issues of heritage, because there's really significant differences. They often serve different communities. Some are for youth, some are for women. Some of them are much older. Some are on specific issues like mental health. So we didn't want to work with just one group in each city, but we wanted to really be embedded in community organisations, and we couldn't realistically work with every organisation. So we tried to pick 2 in each city that we could work with to get a bit of diversity of the kind of community organisation there. And this is something that's been absolutely central to the project. So when we were designing the questions, we were trying to understand the priorities of Somali communities in these cities and how they think about connections to the Somali Peninsula. We've constantly had dialogue. We have an online meeting every month where we meet with all these groups and we keep them updated. We've had various workshops and things as well. So you can see some of that going on here, just some stuff about the methods we've been using. These are some of the kind of workshops we've done where we set the research agenda, and then most recently in November and December, the last big round of workshops, we took data from each city and shared it with the other cities and asked them how they connected. So this was a really nice kind of experience where we cut out loads of quotes, anonymised, from Sheffield and Camden, for example, and then had a discussion in Bristol around that information, those quotes, what resonated with people, what differences there were, among other things. And we had some discussions around home, which I'll talk to, on ideas of home and associations with home as well.
How are you doing? Good.
So I won't go into detail on these because of time again, but it's sometimes quite helpful to look at this geographically. And in the workshops, we talked quite a lot about this. And the communities were interested in seeing the other cities. How the Somali community was concentrated or distributed in the other cities. So Camden is obviously a borough of London, which is one among many. It's not got the highest number of Somalis of any population of any London borough, but it is quite high. And you can see there some of the numbers from the census, which everybody thinks are wrong, but at the same time, it gives you some sense. A relatively small population compared to the whole population of Camden, but still quite significant compared with many other ethnic groups. And they're distributed in different ways. So Kilburn and Kentish Town are these quite traditionally Somali areas where people move to, but there's also a large community around Somers Town and near St Pancras. And what's interesting about this area around King's Cross and St Pancras is the huge redevelopment at Coldrop's Yard, which many of you may have seen if you've been in London and wandered around there, which is right in the middle of where a lot of Somalis live and pass through. And for a long time, they felt quite like excluded from it. But now one of their community groups actually has an office right in the middle of that space and is taking quite a lot of kind of ownership of it. And that's a group we've worked with quite closely, a youth group. But that connection to King's Cross has a really interesting kind of role in Camden, including in relation to actually quite a lot of crime associated with connections to Europe. Camden has had a lot of challenges around knife crime and drugs, even more than in our other cities as well, which has really come through in our interviews. Bristol, what you see here is the closest concentration. Really, most of the Somali community concentrated in these areas. And the other reason I've showed these maps, just to go back, is because they show these kind of indices of deprivation. So you can see here that these are some of the most deprived areas of Bristol, according to those indicators of multiple deprivation. Sheffield, they're a more spread out community. We're working particularly with communities in Burnley and Broomhall. And that's also interesting because they have separate mosques. There are sometimes, I mean, I think the community feels one Sheffield community, but there are also some distinctions and occasionally, I think, tensions, not major ones. But there's definitely a sense of two distinct groups with slightly different identities. And again, these are in quite relatively deprived areas of the city. So I'm going to say a little bit now about, this is drawing on Abdi's work, where he was just giving the overall framework for how we think about transnationalism and a few statistics really and background information about Somali migration and Somali diaspora globally and in the UK, which I'll go over quite quickly because it's not so urban in focus, but it's important for context. This just tells you about the number of Somalis who are out in the world beyond the Somali peninsula itself, and how that's grown. This is according to census numbers in different countries, which everybody will agree are not entirely reliable and often very problematic in terms of how they frame the categories. So I won't go too much into this, but particularly for Somalis, because there are questions about ethnic identity and national identity, and there's the Somaliland distinction. There's also interesting issues coming through about how much Somalis identify as African, when that's a subcategory. And all of these things mean that the reporting in the census is not always very helpful or accurate. But that gives you some sense of the increase. And then what's also interesting is if you look at the politics and the conflicts within Somalia and within the wider Horn of Africa, that's obviously had recurrent effects in terms of new waves of migrants coming and asylum seeking and refugees, but also the demands that's placed on communities here in terms of remittances in the context of crisis within Somalia. So there's huge amounts of resource that obviously get sent back. There are some remittances the other way, which is interesting. You know, occasionally you will see families in Somalia who are supporting families here in particular ways, but that's still relatively unusual. And there are lots of challenges around this, and I'm sure many of you are well aware of this, around banking systems and so on. So a few other things, which is just some of the specificities of citizenship, formal citizenship for Somalis, which again has some effect on how people imagine their futures and where they belong and where their children might be. So there are particular rules of patrilineal descent, whereby anybody who can evidence, and this is normally done informally through clan elders, who can evidence that their father was Somali by nationality, can claim Somali citizenship. But of course, this is highly gendered because it doesn't apply the other way. So if you have mixed parentage and your mother is Somali but your father is not, you can't claim citizenship in the same way. There have been some interesting efforts to change that have not happened, which is another story. Yeah, so there are many, many people with dual citizenship for this reason. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they feel like citizens or have all of the rights of citizens in their practice. Okay, so just to sort of take this a bit more into the academic space, which I won't dwell on, and it's a new field to me, which is partly why I've been doing this, but there are obviously evolving debates on transnationalism that we hope to speak to, even before you get to the urban. And there's a lot of literature talking about this over several decades that talks about the kind of new forms of identity, new forms of capital accumulation, new forms of consciousness, different ways of engaging with politics that come from transnational identities, broadly speaking. And I think also there's increasing recognition that transnationalism doesn't necessarily undermine integration, even though there's still a belief in policy circles that if people are connected to somewhere else and have a dual identity and citizenship, this somehow affects their ability to integrate. This is clearly not really evidenced very well, but it's part of the wider set of discourses we're trying to speak to as we think about also outputs for policymakers that come out of this work. But that's just a bit of academic background. I'm now going to just dive into a load of data in different forms and then have a few reflections, but go into a discussion after that. And as I say, this has not been kind of fully developed or analysed, and there's no paper here yet or anything like that. I'm going to start by talking about our cities in England, to say like they're obviously all English cities of quite different histories, different economic makeups, but I'm here drawing on data from these focus groups we did as part of our workshops, as well as interview data. So I want to start by saying how challenging it has been for people to make a home, for some people to make a home in the UK and to achieve this idea of home. This is quite an extreme example, but this is somebody who came here as a refugee, has been moving from country to country, has crossed different parts of the sea 5 times. Oh, sorry. How do I get that? Sorry, yeah. It was a very sad story, really, because this person, he had eventually got an asylum application through, and then suddenly ran into these issues with the police essentially around a motorbike that he sold to someone, but the paperwork didn't transfer, and then he was being charged in relation to something like a speeding ticket. So it was a speeding ticket that he didn't know he had to pay, and he's had his license revoked. So, having finally got to this point, still feels like he can't really make a sense of home here, and has never been able to make a sense of home. Now that's quite extreme, but this idea that like I'm in Britain, the UK is supposed to be my safe space, and been granted asylum, that dream has still not been realised for this person. For other people, it's not such an extreme story, but there's still all kinds of people who have a mixed heritage and different kinds of backgrounds that mean they don't necessarily feel they fit anywhere. So this is an example of one person who described herself as a lost Somali because she'd grown up in Kenya. And there are many people we speak to who've grown up in Kenya or Ethiopia, or elsewhere in Africa or in Europe. So it's not just a case of Somalia in the UK. And she makes the point that Somalis don't consider her properly Somali, but then in Kenya, they think she's Somali, so she doesn't quite fit in, and she's subject to different kinds of behaviour because of issues around Kenyan Somalis. So there's that sense of being a bit lost. Interestingly as well, when people reflect on their parents and sometimes grandparents, they make this point that those people really belong when they go back. But themselves, the second or third generation, they go back and feel like tourists, they don't feel like it's home. And it's even more extreme with their kids. So there's this kind of intergenerational differences. At the same time, there are all these kinds of ways, in sort of obvious and less obvious, I guess, that people make a sense of home here in cities in England. And what's interesting here is that sometimes it's very much about social spaces outside the house, outside the home in that sense. And in other cases, it is about being at home, but while connected in various ways beyond. So this first quote is from someone where we were talking about ideas of home, who talks about the coffee shops. This comes through a lot with men particularly, because they're often quite gendered spaces. And interestingly, coffee shops where Somalis kind of tend to congregate in the UK cities are actually quite a lot more gendered than they are in Somalia. So through talking to us colleagues in Mogadishu, you will have much more mixed gender spaces than you do, for example, in Sheffield or Bristol. But these coffee shops really represented home to this man. Because, and Stapleton Road, this particular road in Bristol is really highlighted because there are so many, and it's a very, very much a Somali space. Interestingly, it used to be, I mean, it was highlighted by Suzanne Hall in her work as a super diverse street, and this project on really diverse streets in the UK. But we think it's probably become somewhat less diverse over time because it's become very Somali, and there may not be actually as many different nationalities as there were 20 years ago. But we're not certain of that because we're not doing specifically research on that. But what's interesting is that while this person feels really at home in these spaces, they don't feel at home in their own house. This is a contrast with a woman in the next quote who says she doesn't feel at home in friends' houses, but feels really at home in her own house. And this is partly about wearing, coming home from work, wearing traditional Somali clothes, but also being on the phone at home, being connected. So it's clear that for that person, being in the house feels like home, but partly through these connections to Somalia. We also had really interesting things coming through about home, such as this person who talks about the water and the rivers in Sheffield, of which there are many, and how much that reminds him of home, of growing up in a particular part of Ethiopia, where there was a lot of rainfall and a lot of rivers. and how he really stops and enjoys these river spaces to get this feeling of home as he's going to Sheffield. So in these groups, we asked people to bring in an item that represented home to them as a kind of way of starting conversations. And that we were very open as to what home might mean. It could be something about here, it could be something about Somalia. And of course, many people brought things in that they had with them, but that reminded them of Somalia. But it was quite interesting hearing the choices that people made. Sometimes, many people did bring something in, but then they discussed something that reminded them of home. That might be a place or a feeling that they got in the city where they live in England, or it might have been a photograph. But so there are things that people brought in, like this camel bell, for those who grow up. And of course, there's a lot of nomadic heritage, and there's a lot of romanticization of nomadism and camel herding in Somali poetry and literature and so on. So there were several things to do with that came through. For several people, going to the mosque was really a feeling of home, and then things associated with that, clothing, perfumes, was something that really made them feel at home. So again, outside the house, but in the community. And yeah, we had a few other examples, and then quite different things. Like someone brought a photograph of his naturalisation ceremony in the UK. So when he became, passed the citizenship test in the UK, and was really proud of that moment and highlighted the Queen's image and the flag in the picture and so on as his feeling at home. Obviously, these are different generations as well. His decision to focus on different things was reflected in those items. And we also had, interesting, like there was a guy who was quite old who talked about the smell of Bristol's air and the weather in Bristol. He said, the weather in Bristol is very changeable, and I can smell it when I come back. And he said, when he's in other cities in the UK, he feels a bit anxious, and it doesn't have that feeling of home. So it's really connecting with Bristol specifically, and English weather in that feeling of home. So that was kind of an interesting exercise. I just wanted to highlight a few things. And now I'll say a little bit, and this is really largely, I'm just going to give some summaries of some of the interviews we did with people who've gone back to Somali cities. Rather than looking at direct quotes. One thing just to point out, which I guess is obvious, is that people have very different attitudes towards returning and have very different experiences going back. So I don't have all the data here, but we could go into all the different reasons why people go back. And there's one life story that highlights this. But there are people who also have an incredible time and then start imagining their futures back there. And there are others who go back there, perhaps not out of choice, who have quite traumatic experiences, particularly younger people, as I'll explain. But here, I'm sorry about all this text, but this is just a few of these really summarized, as I didn't have time to kind of pick out ideal quotes, but we do have these summaries of some of the interviews that were done with returnees. This is a woman who went from Camden back to Somalia to work there, and we have a number of people who either get asked to come back or go back and then find work in government, often become very successful. The diaspora obviously have a lot of advantages due to education in Europe and those kinds of things. But she talks about how, she felt that belonging in London, but was always nervous of other cities in the UK. And also, interestingly, makes that comparison that in Mogadishu, she thinks that, and we hear this a lot, there's a lot of diversity. Things like clan identity, which can obviously have created a lot of conflict in Somalia, are not so prominent. People's accents, we've had interesting conversations about how accents change in Mogadishu and people become less identifiable in terms of their clan or their heritage. And so she was identifying the comfort of London with the relative safety and comfort of Mogadishu compared to smaller towns in Somalia. So that was interesting. And then what comes through these stories as well is how returning diaspora from the UK are often seen as a problem, particularly younger people in Somalia, particularly if they've been maybe involved in things in the UK and their parents have sent them back for one reason or another. And some of those problems then get transferred. So there are really mixed reputations, and there's a lot of discrimination that returnees face when they go back as well, particularly younger people. To look at another example, and again, I'm just trying to pick out a few bits here. This is a businessman who grew up in London, although actually he'd been in Bristol, which is sort of how we traced him. And then he came back permanently to Somalia. So some people go back and know they're going to stay, others go back for a few years. Let's go back periodically, obviously. But there are a number of people who have identified Brexit or COVID or particular experiences in the UK as some turning points to go back. And also, interestingly, he mentions Nairobi, and we spent a week in Nairobi having a workshop with our Somali colleagues, but also doing research there on the Somali community, because Nairobi's become such a kind of hub for Somali diaspora seeking to achieve things economically that are harder to do in Somalia, but also where there's somewhat more freedom and opportunity than there are in the UK or in Europe. So certain cities, and Nairobi is really, I think, coming to the fore, also have a role in the wider imaginary of urban life and urban future for many Somali people. And that Nairobi aspect is really, really interesting. Of course, we could also talk about cities in the US and cities in the Gulf. There are other places that feature increasingly in the kind of wider urban imaginary, you might say. Interestingly, he highlights hotels as important places of belonging. So I think this really speaks to this kind of transnational identity. These are quite elite people, some of these people who have gone back permanently for work, who are easy to identify for it. So we know we're not getting a full sample. And that really contrasts with some of the people we're speaking to in the UK. And the other thing I wanted to highlight here is about Islam and the degree to which Islamic identity has become important for many Somalis. And I think we found, almost without exception, although we've not done surveys on this, that when you ask people about their levels of identification as Somali, as British, as Bristolians or Camdeners, as African, as Muslim, Muslim will always come above African as a source of identification. And quite often the city identity will come above a national identity of any kind. So you have this really interesting mix of a religious and an urban identity in some cases. Just one more of these, again, which draws out a few different things. This is someone who, again, grew up in London and Bristol, has that experience of kind of 90s, which are really tough, I think, for that generation who came here as kids in the 90s and are now middle-aged. They faced a lot of challenges because they came at a time when there were really not many Somalis, they didn't have networks, they didn't have organizations. And I think you can identify those generational differences in terms of the challenges compared to the older people who are still really connected and have that sense, Mogadishu is my home. And then the younger people who often have a sense, Bristol or Camden is my home. There's also these gendered differences that come through. So, I mean, this is not necessarily what everyone would say, but he really felt that women have found it harder, and his wife has found it harder to integrate back, partly maybe because they found it easier to integrate here. And this perhaps reflects a story I won't go into about the success of girls in school relative to challenges faced by boys who are often dropping out or getting involved in crime or seen to be somehow going through a major change, and a load of risks come in, and parents are very, very worried about this with their boys when they get to a certain age. So those differences perhaps also reflect the level of identification and comfort people feel in Britain, and what that means when they go back as well. Yeah, and so just set out at the bottom there, you can see these three categories of people who go back. The high flyers working for the UN or government. These are many of the people we managed to speak to, or our colleagues managed to speak to in Mogadishu or Hargeisa. Business people and entrepreneurs, and then those who are lost and confused. And that term, Dahan Ellis, is a term for returning to your culture. And it's associated with these kind of schools or kind of centres of that people are sent back to sort of have a form of re-education, cultural re-education. And they're normally children who are having real difficulties, or young people who are having real difficulties in the UK. So we really have a diversity of kinds of returnees. Okay, just to kind of wrap up, because I know I'm running low on time, I think I'm near the end of my cobbled together slides. There's just a few of the infrastructures we might think of. One, of course, is around remittances and the various structures for that, but also how that's changing among generations and how it affects people's sense of where they belong. So many people will send back remittances. This is well known, it's well researched, but for younger generations, it's much more of a formality almost, and something they feel they have to do. There are also various quite strongly enforced, I think, cultural norms around how many children you have and then how much you send back. So people with more children will send back an amount related to how many children they have, for example. But also you have young people who feel like the money is going to sort of random people they don't know, they have no connections, they're a bit reluctant about it. And actually there's efforts to try and harness that money to go towards development projects or supporting local government activities rather than going back to family, because there's a change happening where people feel less connected to those families. And the older generations are frightened of that because they worry that they will lose those links to their family and culture. So there's really like strong intergenerational tensions coming through that communities we've worked with in cities in Bristol or Camden have actually asked us, you know, can your project help us work through some of these tensions, because we almost need an independent arbiter, because our conversations are stalling, resulting in conflicts, resulting in arguments between husbands and wives that drive children out of the home, that then lead people into criminal activities, and there's this kind of cycle of conflict. And a lot of it is around how people do or don't connect back home and connect to their culture. And of course, clan is this very double-edged thing that can cause people, you know, it can lead to conflict, but can also allow people to go almost anywhere in the world where there might be a Somali community and have somewhere where they belong. So that's something that I think is quite distinctive in the way to Somali experience. And then social media was the last thing I wanted to highlight, because that's another of the technological infrastructures that, of course, is changing the way all this is. And that's something that everyone will be aware of. But when you combine it with the things I've been talking about and things around clan as well, it takes quite particular characteristics. So on the positive side, people are getting all kinds of advice when they're based in Mogadishu from this diaspora all over the world, including things like medical advice, advice on migration and where to go, and where your clan might be based, that really allows people to land in the right places. But there are concerns that this is making the whole culture with which people connect across continents more individualistic, less based in these kind of communal values that are central to people's religion and identity. And of course, this sense that people just stay in their rooms often, connecting around the world, but not necessarily connecting even to their families or wider communities. And this becomes a bit of a cycle. So again, that idea that people might feel they belong at home, but only because of how they're connected digitally comes through. And we also see through some of this, the clan conflicts and other conflicts playing out. So this is particularly evident in the Somali community around drill music, and how often there are basically forms of gang warfare, sometimes linked to clan, that are happening on social media. Social media is considered by many parents to be this very dangerous space. We all know this. But in this particular community, there are issues around gang culture and clan that sometimes they only really come up as conflict online, but then that translates into real life on the streets of cities through people meeting, fighting, including women in some cases, and really quite violent. Okay, so I'm going to stop. I do not have any fixed conclusions, as I've said, but I just wanted to highlight, so this idea that's in the framing of the project around transcontinental urban citizenship. The idea is not to say there's a form of citizenship and belonging that is right or that is fixed, but actually there are all these things happening that people do to bring meaning to their lives and their identities. And a lot of that is about belonging in two places, which is central to belonging in either place, if you see what I mean. These things are very much interconnected. And we can see how people strategize to make the most of those opportunities, but also how this is working across these different generations. And in the context of recurrent crises, both here and there. So this is something we're kind of, as I say, exploring more. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on some of the material, anything at all, because we've yet to start. We've got a whole bunch of papers we want to write, and we've not really started yet. That's a challenge for the rest of the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And that's really something else we're speaking. I could see some parallels with some of the other African diaspora communities. I know Nigerians tend to send their boys home, especially when they start getting into funny behavior. Yeah, So thanks very much, everyone. We're going to have a quick response from our new postdoctoral research associate, Dr. Patient Azande, and then we'll throw it open for discussion. But you're welcome to put in your comments and questions in the chat box while Patient is giving us initial reflections.
Thank you very much for throwing me right into the deep end. Okay. So thanks, Tom, for this very interesting presentation on the Somali diaspora. And this, I must say, is a very interesting and timely intervention to the literature on transnationalism, translocality, and all of the concepts that we like to throw around in mobility and migration studies. And also looking at how the socio-spatial transboundary interconnectedness shapes our understanding of the everyday lives of not just migrant populations, but diaspora populations living in the UK in this instance. Now, this is also interesting because oftentimes when policymakers think about integration, they conflate it with assimilation. And this is one component of the literature that has received little attention in terms of looking at integration, belonging, or becoming an urban citizen as something that is in three ways. So you look at the experiences of the diasporan population, but you also, secondly, you also look at their interactions with the people around them, the communities that they live within, that's mutual accommodation. But then there is this third dimension of how they do not lose themselves just by moving, but also have connections, transboundary connections with people back home. And that's something that receives very minimal attention in the literature and even in policy circles. So I remember in 2024, when we had this anti-migration protests that wave across the country, every time I watched the news, you would see politicians talk about how these protests are occurring because migrant populations are not integrating properly. And every time I listen to that, I would ask myself, what does integration mean? What do you mean when you say migrant populations are not integrating properly? And if you were to design a bill or to make policy recommendations, what would you be proposing? Because then it would seem like this whole discussion around integration is, it would seem like they're thinking about assimilation and not like they want people to, they do not understand that whole concept of integration. And then also the fact that the migrant populations are not a homogeneous group. And so the ways in which the policy would manifest might be different for different groups. And then when you talk about belonging, integration, becoming an urban citizen, it's a process and not a final state. So integration is a process, belonging is a process, it's not a final state of being. So when people, policymakers, politicians think about, or academics think about integration, what is the process? Do we understand how these processes manifest in different, for instance, ethnic groups, for instance? Because the processes through which the Somali group might go through to experience belonging or finally say we see ourselves as citizens might be different from another cultural group, say the Kenyan migrant populations here in the UK, for instance. So there are complexities and there are layers to integration, to belonging, and becoming an urban citizen. That's the point I'm trying to make. And it's good that we understand this, start up the conversation, contribute to the conversation so that we can increase our understanding of what this means. And another dimension to this is also the intersectionality part of it, which you, I was glad you integrated into your research, because intersectionality, how integration, belonging, and urban citizenship, how it impacts different genders, people of different age groups, it's different. And that's very important. So that's another important contribution that I can see your study making. And then another aspect which is very important, and I'm glad you also mentioned it, is that the perspectives on integration and urban citizenship or belonging can vary based on migration status. So for temporary migrants, for instance, what does integration or belonging mean? Because they are temporary and they might not seek to remain long-term. So what does that really mean? How do they see that? And if we're talking about policy designs, for instance, how would that look like? Then permanent migrants. And then we also look at it from the perspective of asylum seekers, or those who have come here voluntarily, who have come here on their own through other legal routes. Integration, belonging, the processes might be different. It might be easier for some and a lot more difficult for others. Then one thing that I wanted to ask, because at the beginning, I think where you had the structure of your presentation, you talked about how you said you were going to talk about the implications for policy. So one of the things I saw there was that the policy direction you were going at seemed to be a more internationally focused policy. So in terms of what local policy might look like, so within the UK, for instance, what kinds of local policies can the findings of your research speak into, and not just what FCDO or the national government should be doing internationally, but what will these forms of integration, programs of integration look like locally? That's one thing. And then considering that, like I said, the dimensions and some of the intricacies are quite complex. So how would policy in this direction really look like? What are you thinking? What is your team thinking about? And then another thing I wanted to know from you is there anything that really stood out for you in this research? Any of the findings that really hit you and you were like, oh, I wasn't expecting this. How is this? How can we look at this more intently? Then finally, before I leave the floor to others, it seemed like the focus was more on the elite groups within the Somali community. There was one quote from a refugee, an asylum seeker, about how they viewed home. But most of the other excerpts from the interviews were about the elite group. So was the focus more on the elite groups, or did you focus on everybody? And if so, did you see any significant differences in the ways in which the asylum seekers or people on lower socioeconomic status saw themselves as belonging within these spaces as compared to the elite groups? So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would you respond? Or we collect questions and then you respond.
I'm happy to that. If people have some now, I can.
All
So,
right.
moderating, one of the questions online is that time included. Maybe if you start to these questions.
If you have questions online, you can raise your hand, so we give you a chance to speak.
So, yeah, so I think at the moment, maybe if you want to make some.
Yeah,
comments.
yeah. Thank you so much, Patience. It's a pleasure to have you here. And to get your thoughts on this and really interesting reflections and questions. And I think, yeah, in terms of the questions you posed towards the end, so I guess I might start with this question of what we're proposing in terms of policy change and what it might mean at the local community level as opposed to national and international. And actually, most of our focus has been on that level. And we've developed, so Kathy, particularly my colleague Kathy Bookop, has led on this, but she's developed a note that we're a kind of an output of sorts that we're sharing with our community partners, and we're just finalising it because it's very much for them in their use as community groups that seek funding, that have engagements with city and local councils. And there's a framework in that which is really about how communities have been able to move. So Somali communities in these different cities, different areas, have moved from a sort of situation of survival, where they're often really just coping with basic needs and trying to avoid harm in their lives and fighting where to live and access basic services, to a situation of security where they feel they have a long-term prospect and they feel secure, to one of success. And what we're looking at is tracing through our data in different fields, whether it's housing, whether it's social life, whether it's education, whether it's about security and crime. There are different spaces. There's kind of a table we have, like a sort of matrix, where in some areas there's been a shift, from survival to security to success that's really been very evident. And in other areas, they still feel like they're more in that space of survival. So there's a framework which we've been sort of developing with our community partners that we hope might be useful for them to kind of also tell their own stories in a different way. So, we've been really successful in this area in supporting our community, but less so in this area. And to try and analyse in perhaps a kind of theory of change kind of way, why that's been possible in some spaces and not in others. So that's one thing we're developing. So we're actually, part of the reason we haven't written any academic papers yet is that we wanted to prioritise some other kinds of non-academic outputs, including that one for communities. But then we also are having conversations with some people in different bits of government about a policy briefing that might be more suitable for national government, because there are people working in the Ministry for Communities and Local Government, as well as in the Foreign Office, together thinking about diaspora communities and their different needs. And then we're going to develop a policy report for the Somali government, which is also thinking about how to help reintegration of people who come back. So that will come out of the work with the Somali public agenda. So I think there's three kind of policy areas we're going to work. One is the community level, one is the UK government level, and then one is actually in the region. But we still need to advance a lot of that work. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight. In terms of the complexity, I guess that's one of the ways we're trying to deal with it, is to think, what are the different domains of urban life that have come through as important, and what are the different degrees of success and security that communities have achieved, and that community organisations have been able to help them achieve in that way. In terms of things that jumped out, it's actually quite hard because there's so much. It's been so interesting because there are so many surprises, I think, and I say that as someone who is deeply familiar with diaspora studies and had Somali colleagues and friends that I've kind of grown to be friends over time, partly through this project. So it's been a learning curve for all of us. But, one of the things that's perhaps most interesting is when we went to Nairobi and we spoke to young Somali researchers who did interviews for us in Mogadishu with people connected to Bristol and Camden and Sheffield, and what they were surprised by in terms of the lives of Somalis in the UK. And this, I think, speaks to your point about elites and so on, because actually I probably misrepresented the overall research here, because the interviews that happened with Somalis who gone back to work in Somalia, in Hargeisa and Mogadishu, those are people who tend to be quite elite. They've got to the point where they've got government jobs and they've got a good education, and They may not always have been elites in the UK, but they were when they perhaps went back. And they were easy for us to identify. So we really wanted to trace people who lived in Camden, Sheffield and Bristol and gone back of all different socioeconomic categories. But it was hard to actually find those people to interview in the industry. It's just easier to find. Whereas in the UK, we have, interviewed people from really across the spectrum, including the people who are very new arrivals as refugees who are really struggling, people who are living in really dilapidated council housing, who may be second or third generation, but are still struggling with various things, and people who are in between, middle class, British, Somalis. So we do actually have a big spectrum, I think, within the UK. But one of the things that's really surprising, I think, is how the social structure flipped in different locations. So, I mean, many of the people who came here who made it to the UK as Somali refugees during the early parts of the Civil War, were civil servants, were highly educated, were middle class, were bureaucratic or elite class, and then found themselves almost at the bottom of the pile in the UK, where they were in very poor housing, limited access to services, lots of forms of discrimination. And yet, when you go to somewhere like Nairobi, there's a sense that Somalis are quite advantaged now. All these opportunities in front of them, even though there is some discrimination. So I think there's different worlds of the opportunity structures being so different for often the same people or the same families, depending on where they are, which is probably something that's no surprise to people in diaspora who see this in their own lives and their own family lives, but it's not necessarily widely known by the people. And I think it's quite extreme in some ways in the Somali case. The extremes of success and of deprivation and hardship in some cases.
Okay, so there's a question online, and then we'll take a round of questions and then respond. Rebecca is asking about how does transnationalism shape conceptualization of citizenship, identity, and the notion of home, particularly within context of mobility and displacement? And to what extent does this transformation influence social cohesion, belonging, and integration, like the refugees? And I have a similar question. My question is, you talked about some who had migrated who had been part of migrant communities in Europe and all.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if their experience was different from those who came into the UK directly, and if perhaps this feeling of home was different from those who came in as refugees versus those who came in as voluntary migrants.
Yeah.
Before you respond to that, do we have any other questions or comments in the room?
I just wanted to comment that it's quite interesting that this concept of home and belonging is coming up. So I'm sort of many generations now, about 3 or 4 generations UK, more precisely Scottish descendants. And what I'm been very interested is looking at my own family history, and this whole concept of belonging and transnationalism occurs sort of pre-First World War for me. And my great-great-grandmother is sort of the nexus of that normalisation and sort of identity as British, because she brought up the grandchildren and educated the grandchildren, but she also provided sort of a safe space for students. So it's just and it's a very different experience from coming in as a migrant. But she was more or less marooned.
She was more or less
Marooned
because
of the First World War. She was
It's just
So I think that's where the background of history comes in. We didn't need passports. No, yes. So if you were a member of empire, so that's before the British Empire and other Commonwealth, you could travel anyhow. I mean, I was listening to the TV, was it 2 nights ago, so about 100-year-old Trinidadian guy who said, when a lot of the young men in the UK had gone, they started drafting in from the colonies. He was just brought up from Trinidad to join the munitions factory. He actually was Sheffield. So, but I mean, and he showed his whatever it is certificate, and that's what he said he used for his entire life. He never had a passport. So that's
how you get really much, I guess.
So you've got this periodization of when people are coming in and what the migrant situation is, and whether it's a war situation and so on and so forth, and how that then affects your identity with place. Because I was saying, I had bring it right back to Liverpool. Liverpool had a set of Jewish refugees, some of whom ended up getting the Nobel Prize in certain parts of the country. But they were only in transit. A lot of them went off to America after that. So, it's not only Africans, but I think notions of citizenship and movement, and I guess where you are educationally and class-wise comes into the discussion in a way in which the narrative, certainly politically now, doesn't take into account at all.
Yeah,
it's more a comment. I guess, how do we situate?
Yeah, it's a moment in time. I mean, one of the things we want to do now, as part of our last bit of work with our community groups, is to sit down with a timeline actually, and say that, I mean, probably just going back 3 or 4 decades, since particularly the large number of refugees came in the 90s, and then, you know, from that time onwards, where there's been things that happened in the UK that have been very significant around changes to citizenship rules and migration policy and Brexit and everything else, and then also around changes in Somalia and different episodes of conflict. And so, you know, how has this affected your work? I mean, people come at different times, come under such different conditions. And of course, so one thing is that, and that's why we do have a focus on refugee diaspora within the project, but we're very conscious and often reminded, and as we should be, that this is not a community of, you know, they predate the refugees by a long time, Somalis in the UK. They had a strong presence and a strong identity and role in all kinds of ways before any refugees came. So many people don't necessarily want that association. And others identify quite strongly, of course, because they have come as refugees and it's been fundamental to their identity. And the paths that people take, you know, are just, you know, remarkable in terms of the different places where they live. So arriving somewhere where you have a community and you have something like a plan structure that might help with that becomes all the more important. I think to your point, Tyler, about the differences between those who come from Europe and not is really interesting. And I didn't know enough about it when I sort of did the project proposal, or I would have built it in more and possibly even done a European city comparison. But we get some of it coming through, particularly in Bristol and Camden, less in Sheffield, where people have lived in Norway or the Netherlands. And sometimes people have actively come to the UK because they think there's more opportunity, they can exercise their culture more, there's more opportunity for them, there's not such a sort of stigma to them being Somali in a way. And of course, in a lot of those European countries, there's a tendency to disperse in a much more radical way. So people will be maybe the only Somali family in a small town in Norway. And they will grow up and their kids will be very Norwegian, and they will feel very strongly attached to that identity. But also, they'd rather live in the UK, where, you know, there is a much more vibrant sense of the Somali community and its own identity within a British identity, which I feel that there's less space for them to have that identity. They're more Norwegian or Dutch. And I think so that's an interesting difference as well. But I don't want to say too much about it until we've done a bit more. And there's a lot of analysis we still need to do. So even in terms of the most surprising things, or, you know, the overall nature of the findings, I haven't even looked at all data yet because there's so much, and we've had a number of people doing interviews. So yeah, but there's no doubt these very different pathways, very different experiences, and then you combine that with class differences and socioeconomic differences. You know, Somalia has what, in the words of Robtel, full name Robtel Paley, who's from from Liberia, and she wrote this book on the diasporocracy, this idea of a government primarily by diaspora. She was talking mainly about Liberia, but you know, in Somalia you have huge numbers of MPs. I don't think it's a majority at the moment. It changes, hundreds of MPs with dual nationality, usually British or European, maybe North American. And so there's that sense in which you know, you have these people who are going back and kind of running the country, and even people in our own network who were working as a community organisation in Sheffield, then went back and suddenly were the minister or something or else, you know. So they're also moving between working to support vulnerable, marginalised communities in the UK and then being part of kind of establishment. So these categories of class and privilege are very fluid, and it's hard to get your head around when you've grown up in Britain with this idea of, you know, a very rigid class system such as it is. When you superimpose that on, you know, hypermobility and something like clan as well, it's really hard to get your head around. So yeah, we're learning a lot about different forms of stratification and how they're changing over time.
I have a question based on your last statement about how the diaspora are a very significant financial benefit to one country in terms of remittance. But there was a quote about how the diaspora thinks about local politics and how that kind of affects what's happening back with negative. Is that part of, or is that associated with how they are perceived in Somalia, that sense of tension about people coming back home, probably taking positions of power in politics, or it's much more fluid or very distant?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to be too categorical about sort of negative perceptions, because obviously it can work both ways. I mean, it's very, having the dual passport benefit, having that European passport, British and Dutch or whatever it might be, when you go back, you know, has so many advantages for people. But then, of course, there is quite a lot of resentment, because there are jobs, you know, there are salary differentials, there are access to different kinds of jobs that come with foreign degrees, but also with foreign passports. So there's kind of some resentment at that level. And then in a very different way, like we heard, for example, in Nairobi about how Somali, because there are so many different kinds of Somali in Nairobi, right? So there are Kenyan Somalis who grew up in Kenya, they're Kenyan nationals, and they might have come from another part of the country to the city. Then there are Somali refugees who have been living in camps, you know, Dadaab out there in really harsh conditions. Some of them might come to the city. Then you've got European Somalis returning. And one thing we heard is that those European Somali youth were associated with a lot of problems in large areas of Nairobi, because, not large areas, but specific areas. So it was a subcategory of returning Somalis who'd come from Europe, where the whole reason they'd been sent back was often to reset. Yeah, so then it means you've got particular stigma associated with that group. And as I say, we had really interesting conversations around accents, and where people within the Somali community might want to conceal an accent that reveals where they grew up, whether it's in Europe, the US, or even just a particular part of Somalia, and how, depending on whether you're in Mogadishu, a big city, or a small town, you know, there are neutral accents and non-neutral. You know, we're familiar with this in the UK, right? Accent politics, but yeah. So there's so many layers of complexity there.
More questions online?
You have questions or comments online?
Calling online, you're still there?
See, Tammy's there. Hi, Tim. This is not what we're usually talking about. She's gone now.
Yeah. Any final questions, comments in the room? Okay. So, Prof.
Oh.
I
was quite enjoying it. I think, you know, it's always good to have a different view, and I think this is very much, as Thomas said, a work in progress. And I was sort of thinking, you know, the heritage bit, but the heritage bit is there because the identity and what you bring to the table in terms of where you are does have something to do with the heritage, however mixed or transitional the heritage is. And I think
symbol.
Yeah, and what's been really good about the Somali community is a bit like large ethnic groups in Western Africa. It's had a very long and mixed heritage, and to just look at that as a case study has been really, I think, illuminating. Particularly again with the long duration of history, to think about it historically, right up to contemporary times, these issues are very much with us. And I'd go on to say globally, we are getting many more of these transnational communities or diaspora communities who are very much involved, both economically, culturally, and otherwise, in the communities in which they live. So whether they're living in Somalia, Somaliland, the UK, or The Hague, these are large communities who have a lot of influence. And in a way, we do not study them at our peril, because it's very easy to have one homogeneous blob of people, and therefore policy says this. So I think this is really important work that is being done. And in a way, it should be or could be a template for looking at other situations and communities. I would say not even just Africa. I mean, I think we really have to open it up to what's happening elsewhere. Because in a way, I think in the 90s, it was all about the remittance economy. We've kind of moved on from there. Now we've got almost a governance economy as well. So I think it's been a really illustrative discussion. It'd be great to see your maps, when you've got all the maps and so on, looking at, I guess, how it's both concentration and movement, I think would be really interesting, because a lot of these communities are vectors in themselves. So, because we haven't really talked about the Americas as well.
Yeah,
I mean, so there's a lot. This will keep you busy till you're retired.
There's a lot. And it's just, we haven't done any sort of proper mapping, but I think at a conceptual level, we are thinking about that in terms of the places that people talk about those parts of it, is it, rather than, and there's a whole other US angle.
Yeah.
And then that gets into Minnesota and Donald Trump and his treatment of Somalis, which, is a whole other level.
I think it's just political, because I can remember one of these grants where I think it might be King's College London. Anyway, they were funding the medical school in Somaliland. Now, Somaliland does not exist, but this was an FCDO contract. So again, there are all sorts of levels where policy then begins to engage with communities that have I would say, the cultural, both the socio-economic and cultural ability to get these funds through. And why not? So I think it's a bigger discussion, which is why it's a really interesting talk today. And we want you to come back. It's work in progress. So we're waiting to see, it would be great to see how it develops. And
I think
what these collections might be.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully at least one paper will be really focused on the urban contexts, and quite specifically urban, because we're going to speak to various disciplines. But thank you so much for having me. And hopefully I'll come with colleagues next time.
Yes.
And your team.
Thank you very much. Yes, so our next Urban Heritage lecture is on June 24th. And we're going to have Evandro Halls, who is the Deputy Head of West Africa Hub at the UN Habitat. So he'll be telling us about urban development as well. But prior to that, next week, we are going to be at the World Urban Forum in Baku. So Tuesday, we're going to be screening our documentary, Displaced Again, and having a conversation around housing and displacement. So if you're in Baku, please come join us at the Urban Cinema. If you're not, please register for the World Urban Forum, and then you can join us online. So so please stay in touch with us. Follow us on LinkedIn. We have regular updates on everything that's happening, and our website is nearly online. So you can visit and hear what we are doing. But finally, let's just give Tom a very wow. Thank you. You have to die right when you're coming back next. So thanks very much. And I think it's a good place to release you for lunch. And then we'll see you again. Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. That was really interesting.
Thank you for allowing me to do work in progress. So what's your, have you got your own LinkedIn, is it for the centre?
Yes, AHUWA-University.
I'm sure I'm
Touch in the last.
I just wasn't sure who had posted it, but I just, right, that's good. Make sure I follow. Yeah.
Lunch.
That's interesting. It's good to like, we need to start presenting all stuff. So, you know, we should do to start. The name, we've only done migrant background. But it's a lot of data.
Do you want to take your?
Yes, please.
Okay, you should try and your swimming back.
Oh, yeah.
Times. Yeah. I've been.
So you're going to, I'm not going to bother to more of that. You've got a series of events there.
Yes, we are screening, documentary system. Round two.
Yeah, I wish I was going. And no one from, actually, I think you were alive.
Yes. Let me go.
At one point I thought that I was going to be too busy, we have this workshop figuring out, just going. But yeah, then it's makes sense to go this time. I just think that no one could really